In the last chapter, we read chapter 4, titled Beowulf. Beowulf was just on his way up to Hall Herod to meet King Hrothgar and Queen Wealhtheow. Let's make a prediction. What do you think will happen when Beowulf gets there? Go ahead and type that in the chat. What will happen when Beowulf arrives with his warlords to Hall Herod? Chapter 5, 9 Sea Monsters. Hrothgar's hair, once red as fire, had turned white with worry about Grendel. His heart was sickened by slaughter. So many men had waited in Hall Herat to face the fiend, and had been eaten for their courage, that the king had come to think he was being punished for his pride in building such magnificence. He rested his jutting jaw on his hand and welcomed Beowulf without much confidence. "I knew your father," he said, after they exchanged salutes. He was a tall, strong man, with an eye like a hawk's. Beowulf blinked and smiled. "Great Hrothgar," he said politely, "I am not tall, as you see, and my enemies liken my eyes to the bat's. But the bat knows well enough where he is going in the night, and so do I." Hrothgar shook his head slowly, as though it buzzed with sorrow. "I suppose you have come to fight Grendel," he muttered. "Please go home again. There's nothing anyone can do." Beowulf sat down on the steps by the king's throne. His manner was relaxed and easy. Hrothgar could not help liking this plain young man. There was such an air of simplicity about him. He shuddered and touched the scars on his own face, livid marks made by Grendel's claws, as he thought what the monster would do to that simplicity. Beowulf was eating an apple. He bit into it with cheerful determination. The tips of his fingers were square. Hrothgar noticed how strong his wrists were. Beowulf said, "These apples are good. Do you want one?" "Where do they grow?" "In the valley on the other side of the hill. I had my men pick a sackful as we marched past." Beowulf nodded to one of his followers. The man chose an apple from a huge bag he had been carrying on his back and brought it to the king. Hrothgar balanced it on his palm of his hand and considered it doubtfully. "That grove is witch work," he said, looking at Beowulf as though he expected him to be turned into a pig any time. Unferth slouched over a cup, rich mead sticky in his whiskers, grinned agreement. "An old witch spat her teeth out there," he muttered. "They were bad teeth, green and red and rotting. They grew into apple trees. No one in his right mind would eat fruit like that." Beowulf took a big bite and finished his apple, pips, core, and all. "You feel well?" asked the king. "Never better." "But you heard what Unferth said." "I heard." Unferth scowled and poked at his boil. "Only someone wicked could eat witches' apples and come to no harm," he insinuated darkly. Beowulf laughed. Hrothgar thought that it was a long time since he had heard such a free and easy sound in Hall Herat. "I don't like being laughed at," whined Unferth, drawing his dagger. Beowulf swiftly handed him an apple. "I don't peel them myself," he said. "Things seem to lose something with their skins off, don't you think? But every man to his own taste." Unferth skewered the apple with his blade. Hrothgar and Queen Wealhtheow were smiling at his discomfiture. Some of the Geats guffawed, delighted by their leader's quick wit. The Danes laughed too. Unferth was unpopular, and they liked the way this mild-tempered stranger had put him in his place. Unferth could not stand it. He sliced the apple into two and kicked the pieces away. "I say again what I said before," he hissed. "The apples are bad, and only a bad—" "The apples are good," broke in Beowulf, his voice calm but firm. "Listen, Unferth, and I will tell you something. You think that bad brings forth bad only, and that the good man shall hold apart from it. I suggest that things aren't so simple, so black and white. Even the wickedest person can do good for someone. The truly good man finds good where he can." "Oh, so you're truly good, are you?" sneered Unferth. "Not at all," said Beowulf. "Bad teeth don't belong only to witches. I have some myself." He opened his mouth and pointed. Unferth sniggered. Riddled with rot, he said, and your teeth have obviously infected your tongue. Riddles and rots. That's what your talk is. So go ahead and type in the chat. What is the story about these apples? Why is Unferth saying not to eat them? What's the story behind the apples? Queen Wealhtheow leaned forward. Her fair hair trembled with gold in the sunlight that streamed through the hall from a high window. I don't think the stranger talks in riddles, she said. What he said and does makes perfect sense to me. Explain, said the king patiently, still rolling his apple in his hands. Well, said Wealhtheow, I think that Beowulf is trying to show us that in order to overcome evil, we have to admit to a little bit of it in ourselves. He can eat the witch's apple and come to no harm because he has sufficient strength of character to find the good in it. Strength, scoffed Unferth. Bat's eyes and rat's teeth. Quite so, said Wealhtheow. He admits to his weaknesses, and in the admitting they become strengths. This is no usual kind of hero. Hrothgar nodded thoughtfully. I'm inclined to agree with you, my love, although reasoning things out isn't my best point. And I can't pretend to have understood all this apple business as readily as you have. Never mind understanding, the queen said, her blue eyes patient. Just eat your own apple, and I'm sure it's tasty. Hrothgar crossed himself and took a bite. Everyone watched him expectantly. He took another bite. He chewed. He swallowed. He could not help thinking of the witch, but neither could he help admitting that the apple was delicious. It's fine and ripe, he said at last, smacking his lips. Neither too sour nor too sweet. Beowulf beamed, he said. Now about Grendel. Wait a bit, snapped Unferth. What about Brecca? Brecca, said Unferth. Who's Brecca? Unferth's thin lips, were wry and ugly with malice. Brecca, he said slowly, savoring each nasty word, was the name of a friend of a fine hero here. I just remember the story while you and the queen were busy heaping incomprehensible praises on him. Not a pretty story, is it, Beowulf? You tried to drown your friend because he was a better swimmer than you. After Unferth's outburst, some of the Geats wanted to throttle him. They were so furious at this insult to their leader. But Beowulf walked among them coolly, advising restraint. Hrothgar shifted about uneasily on his throne, glaring at Unferth, wanting to apologize to Beowulf for his henchman's uncouth behavior. But Queen Wealhtheow caught at his sleeve and whispered to him to wait and see what Beowulf had to say. It's kind of a test, she murmured behind her hand. So far, everything has gone the stranger's way. Let's watch how he deals with this. Beowulf came and stood before them. His face was pale. His eyes had a faraway look. He spoke with a straightforward seriousness that made everyone fall silent. His voice echoed compellingly in the hushed hall. Mighty Hrothgar, wise Wealhtheow, Beowulf said. The truth is not as your man Unferth has told it. What happened was this. When I was a boy, I had a friend called Brecca. We both loved swimming. We used to go out together and wrestle with the waves, whatever the weather. One day we made a dare with each other, as boys will. The dare was that each of us was to enter the sea, sword in hand, and keep swimming until one gave up. Beowulf smiled as though all of this had struck him with great foolishness now. If you ask me why we took swords, he went on, I can only say that we had some conceited idea of fighting whales with them. Anyway, we were both good swimmers, and we went on and on for 5 days and 5 nights, neither willing to admit defeat until a terrible storm drove us apart. I'll never forget that moment. The sky grew dark at noon, and the wind lashed the sea until it boiled. The creatures of the deep were driven mad by the storm. Something caught hold of me. To this day, I'm not sure whether it was a ferocious sea swell or some monster from the ocean bed, and dragged me toward the rocks at the foot of the cliffs, which suddenly loomed up from nowhere. I clung on hard. I turned to face the roaring waves, and then monsters did indeed appear, 9 of them, one after another, sliding slick with jaws agape through the heaving sea. And then the monsters did indeed appear. Sorry. And then, I just read that. And I swung my sword about my head and fought them off. I killed them. 9 sea monsters. I killed them. The wind stopped. The waves dropped, and I was landlocked shore, exhausted. Lapland shore, exhausted, covered in seaweed, and I slept. As for Brecca, he was not drowned. The current swept him to Norway. He was a better swimmer than I. The Geats burst out cheering as Beowulf finished. They had heard the story before, of course, but never so plainly from Beowulf's lips. He was not given to boasting, and he had offered his account simply as to answer Unferth's lie. King Hrothgar was stirred by the telling of such brave deeds. He was a warrior at heart, and here was something he could easily understand and appreciate. He commanded his servants to prepare a banquet fit for a hero. The feasting and drinking went on for hours. Only Unferth did not join in. He sat in a corner, picking moodily at his boil, glaring at the bright assembled company. Long shadows crept into Hall Herat. Night was coming on. Some of the Danes grew restless and apprehensive. They did not like to show their fear of Grendel, but their hands quivered to where they held the drinking horns, and their eyes kept returning to the door. So before I continue reading, do you think Grendel is going to appear? And what do you think will happen if he does? If it does, I should say. Will Grendel appear? And what do you think will happen if Grendel does appear? Type in the chat. Hrothgar consulted with Wealhtheow. Then he said to Beowulf, "You are determined to face Grendel, come what may?" "I am," said Beowulf quietly. "What is your plan?" "The best plan," said Beowulf. "No plan." Hrothgar shook his head. "You are the bravest man I've ever met," he said, standing up to salute his guest. "If anyone can kill Grendel, it is you." He suddenly noticed something about Beowulf that had escaped his attention before. "Where is your sword?" he asked. Beowulf shrugged. "My sword? Oh, I left it in the sun somewhere. I need no sword." "No sword? But how?" "Does Grendel use a sword?" demanded Beowulf. "Of course not, but he will eat." "Have swords been any good against him in the past?" Beowulf pursued relentlessly. Hrothgar had to admit that they had not, but he could not see how one man, however good and strong, dare face the fiend without weapons. Beowulf held up his hand. "Here are my weapons enough," he said. "I put more trust in these 10 fingers than in 100 swords." Hrothgar wanted to argue. He was desperately worried now. He thought Beowulf mad. He thought it was suicide to wait for Grendel. Grendel, the murderously all-powerful. Without at least a good keen blade for company, what could one man's hands hope to do to that black terror? Queen Wealhtheow silenced her husband's objections. She brought the banquet to a close by giving Beowulf a golden cup to drink from. Beowulf drank deep, his eyes not leaving hers. He handed the cup back to her and smiled as though he had taken sustenance from the deepest well in the world. Then, as the Danes were about to leave, the night already rustling at Hall Herat's doors, Unferth surprised them all, and perhaps himself by saying, "I am going to stay. I want to see what happens when this fool tries to shake hands with Grendel."